disciplines that are essential in the Spiritual Aspirant, Part 1 by Sri Muruganar. Better.
Thank you. We'll start with the prayer verse first.
Anand.
Ramana Maunamai Tandarulum Vedam Ramana Maunamai Tandarulum Vedam Muruganar Murayil வரைந்திட்ட சத்தா நெறிகளை சாதகர் சாதிக்க மத்தகம் மாத்துணையாம் திருரமணார் மௌனமாய் தந்தருளும் வேதம் முருகனார் தேற்று முறையில் வரைந்திட்ட சத்தா நெறிகளை சாதகர் சாதிக்க மத்தகம் மாத்துணையாம் மத்தகம் மாத்துணையாம்.
Devotees may their practice to the true paths devote, in which Muruganar to clear our doubts rose. Of the Veda which in silent grace Sri Ramana spoke, the bulging-browed elephant do we invoke.
Namaskaram. Om Namo Bhagavate Sri Ramana. So that was the pāyiram, or the prefatory verse. And these are the questions for Robert. Robert himself composed this verse for this the work of Muruganar, which we are going to be discussing once or twice every month, starting today. So the questions to him are, why do we need a pāyiram or prefatory verse? Any insight on the history behind this work? And what is a neṟi? And why do we need to study this work? So Robert, if you could unmute yourself and explain or answer these questions, please.
Yeah, why do we need a pāyiram? Well, the pāyiram just sort of appeared, so whether we need it or not, we got it because I just woke up one morning and there it was. But I think it's good to have one because pāyiram actually means introduction. What this is actually is a kadahulvarta, a mangalam, or a kāpu, which is an invocation to a guardian deity, and which forms part of a typical pāyiram, which includes other things like an avayadakam, in which the author apologizes in advance to his peers for any shortcomings in the work and so on. So the kadahulvarta is a request for the blessings of the deity. And although the subject of the study is the non-dual self, I've suggested that we begin with this invocation to the elephant-headed god Ganapati, or Ganesh, who is generally invoked to bless and ensure the success of new ventures. A similar situation arose in the compilation of Bhagavan's Urudunapadu, as it was nearing its final shape. And the idea was raised by Ganapati Sastri, or Ganapati Muni, as some people know him, that there should be a second Mangalam or dedicatory verse invoking the deity in name and form. I quote now from the introduction to Urudunapadu, which is based pretty much on Sadhu Om's own account in his book of what happened at the time. Ganapati Sastri now raised a further objection, namely that it was customary for all such works to call upon some deity with name and form in their invocation, whilst the existing invocatory verse referred only to the self without name and form. On studying the work again, Ganapati Sastri picked out a verse which referred to Maheshan, a name of Lord Shiva, and suggested this be adopted as a second verse to the invocation. Sadhu Om thinks this was originally verse 39 of the original draft of Urudunapadu. According to Sadhu Om, Ramana and Muruganar felt that, although the subject of the work was the nameless and formless self, it would not be inappropriate to include such a verse for the sake of those whose chosen spiritual path was that of surrender rather than that of self-inquiry, and accordingly acceded to Ganapati Sastri's wishes, incorporating the verse as the second verse of the invocation. So that's sort of a backup to why we should have an invocation. And now the history behind the work. Well, first of all, I'll say a little about Muruganar because a lot of people may not know much about him. He was born in 1890, 10 years Bhagavan's junior, and he was given the name Subramanian, which he later changed to its Tamil equivalent, which is Muruganar. His father died in early childhood, and he was brought up by his mother. He seems to have had issues with speech at an early age and didn't speak till the age of 5. But by the time he came to Bhagavan, he was an accomplished poet and scholar, and he actually was on the editorial committee of the great 7-volume Tamil lexicon, which was in preparation at that time in the 1920s. He was also an ardent supporter of Mahatma Gandhi's independence movement. But after coming to Bhagavan, he vowed henceforth to write only in praise of Bhagavan, to express Bhagavan's teachings or to describe the effect of Bhagavan's teaching upon himself. He composed in the region of 20,000 verses and substantial amounts of prose, consisting of commentaries, Poripurai, and expanded commentaries, Virakurai, on his own verses, and also an extensive prose commentary on Anamalai Akshara Manimalai. Apart from a couple of works, Guru Vachika Kovai and Sri Ramanathan Murai, most of his writings were published after his death in a portmanteau edition edited by Sadhu Om and completed after his passing by K. Swaminathan. I don't really know anything about the origin of the work. I was in the ashram at the beginning of 2020, and I was approached to translate this little book, which it seems to have been quite popular. It's in its 3rd printing of 2,000 copies, and but it's only in Tamil. So people were saying, could I translate it? We don't really know the history of it at all. But when I asked Michael James if he would help me to translate it, he said he would, but he also said that he had scans of the original handwritten manuscript on his computer, which he sent to me. So I thought it would be nice to put those in the book, and we can all read the three things together: the English, the Tamil, and the handwriting. It's very rare to get that opportunity, and I thought it was. It also makes it a very special little book. So that's really all I know about the origin of it. Now, number 3, what is a neṟi? The word has a number of meanings which are relevant. First of all, it means path. Then it means the method for following the path, the qualifications for being on the path, and finally, the goal to be gained on the path. So in a way, it's neṟi is the whole sadhana. So it's a very good word to describe the whole concept of being on a path, trying to reach a goal. Mahatma Gandhi and others have said that the path is the goal. What's that? Which must be true, since the path leads only back to ourself, which in the true sense we never left. So we are the path, we're on the path.
So the word neṟi has a lot of meanings.
Well, also going back to the dictionary, we have these definitions. Way, road, path, way of virtue or religion, rectitude, propriety, honesty, truth, chastity, method, means, expedient, manner, rule, system, row, order, line, series, state of mind, spirit, temper. And the Tamil lexicon adds these are the ones which are one in the women's world. Precept, principle, and finally salvation is the last meaning of the Tamil lexicon. So it means the whole process, really, of trying to find oneself. But you notice in the title it says cattāṉa neṟikaḻ. That's not mentioned in the title, but it's sort of implied. I remember when we were talking about the title, Shankaran and Tiruvannamalai, he sort of preferred this title. I think we could have said true disciplines. The word cattāṉa neṟikaḻ, has 4 relevant meanings. It means being, reality, truth, and essence. Bhagavan teaches us that only unconditioned being is true and real, and that objective truths are fundamentally false. Therefore, being and truth are the same thing. Although the word true isn't there, we can say that it's ultimately derived from the Latin verb to be, esse, and gives the medieval word essential, which means the essence of something. So we have, in a way, it is incorporated in the title. Why do we need to study? There are several reasons we could give, but possibly the most important one is suggested by the verb tetra in the second line of the verse, which, to quote from Winslow's dictionary again, has amongst its meanings to convince, assure, relieve from doubt, to communicate strength, to nourish, invigorate, to clear, clarify, refine, to clear up, decide, to know certainly. One of the main obstacles on our path is likely to be the lack of conviction that Bhagavan's path is the only path that will produce the results we want, and the ensuing constant temptation to investigate some other spiritual path, which might on the surface seem more palatable than the steep path of self-investigation. Bhagavan has said, possibly with a touch of irony, that yes, all paths lead to realization of the self, but only by virtue of the fact that they all eventually lead us back to that original root path of self-investigation. So why waste your time wandering on those paths? Which is a good point. But to return to the point, the study of certain works, and cattāṉa neṟikaḻ is one of them, will help us to clear any such doubts and devote ourselves uniquely to this path. No amount of mental and intellectual gymnastics, of course, will allow us to realize the self. But conversely, without the firm intellectual conviction that there is this one path and no other, we will not be able to develop the focused attention which will enable us eventually to transcend the intellect and merge, or rather realize that we have never not been merged with that non-dual self. By reflecting deeply on these writings, there's no doubt that we will be able to strengthen the conviction, which is our mainstay of our practice. Like the facets of a diamond, each of these sayings embodies an aspect of the reality of the self as reflected in the intellect, demonstrating over and over again that however we look at it, this is the only viable path for us, and thereby giving us an impetus and motivation to keep up our moment task of dwelling in our own being in the self. Another thing I would say about it is that, having read through it, at first I wasn't particularly struck. I hadn't read it all the way through, but the more I read it, the more it seemed to mesh together on different levels. It's like when you've got pieces of straw are not very strong, but if you weave them together, you get a very strong mat. And that was the effect. By the time you've got to the end of these, there's a kind of, they have this cumulative effect, which, as I say, reinforces, if you like, your motivation, your will to keep up the practice. So that was the third one. Why do we need to study this work?
Yeah, that's the last question on this slide.
Oh, we've done it. That's finished, haven't we?
Yeah. Did you have anything else to add to these 4 questions as an answer?
No, I think that's about it.
Okay. Thank you, Robert. That was nice. So would you call this the 96 commandments of Sri Muruganar, sort of? Almost. It's just that there's no right word for neṟi, isn't it? So I'm going to keep the word. I just spoke to Robert and got his consent to just keep the word neṟi. So going forward, you will see us talking about neṟi 1, neṟi 2, neṟi 3, neṟi 4, and so forth.
Yes, I think that's a good idea, because
you know,
there's no one word which will
capture it.
Capture it.
Yeah. So now with that, let's. That was a nice introduction from Robert. We'll go to the first neṟi, and I'm going to request Ananth from Toronto to read it, please. Tamil.
இறை வடிவம் இரண்டனுள் சகலம் சகுணம் சுத்த மாயா காரியம் பரமார்த்தம் அன்று அஃது அப்ராக்கிருதம் எனல் ஔபசாரிகமாம். I'll read it again. இறை வடிவம் இரண்டனுள் சகலம் சகுணம் சுத்த மாயா காரியம் பரமார்த்தம் அன்று அஃது அப்ராக்கிருதம் எனல் ஔபசாரிகமாம்.
Thank you. Thank you. Robert, you could read the English translation and then I'll go to the next slide, please.
Of the 2 forms of God, that which is termed, what I can't read, with form or with attributes, is a product of pure māyā. It is not the supreme. The term transcendental is applied to it only in a metaphorical sense. The word is actually upachara, which means like, it could also mean like politely. You know, we call it politely transcendental.
So I'll go to the talking points here, and Robert will elaborate on it, and he will also add to these. Please go ahead, Robert.
I want to read this out, or let just people read it?
You could read it and explain.
I've got a bit more to add to it.
Oh, yeah, yeah, and you can add to it, right, please.
The primary, this is from the notes to the little book.
Right.
The primary interpretation of māyā in the context of Sri Ramana's teaching is that it is nothing other than mind, of which the root is ego. So what Muruganar is implying in this passage is that God with form or with attributes is a product of our rising ego, just as everything else is. As Bhagavan says in verse 26 of Uludunarpadu, if the ego arises, all else will arise. If the ego is not, nothing else will exist. the ego truly is all. In verse 8 of Urudinapadu, Sri Ramana makes it clear that the worship of God in name and form cannot lead to the final truth, which can only be gained by merging with the Supreme through the process of self-inquiry, in which the ego is annihilated. Sorry, one of the words was covered up there.
Oh, no problem.
So what I would add to that, when the mind rises, it identifies with the body, and then as the ego self, it comes to believe it cannot be truly real because it is subject to death, pain, suffering, all these things, insanity. So it imagines a deity beyond itself, which it calls transcendental. And this deity has all the qualities that it lacks, of eternal life, eternal bliss, and so on. We feel this very strongly in Christian countries, because in the Christian tradition, we taught to invest all our energy of love and truth in such a God, and then we have to pray to that God for him to give it to us back, which he very rarely does, actually. So that's another bit. It is therefore not correct to say that God with former attributes is prakritam, transcendental, beyond nature. And to term it so is a form of aupacarikam, Sanskrit aupacarika, a kind of metonymy by which the attributes of one thing are spoken of as those of, I can't quite read that.
That's fine. Spoken of as those of something or someone connected with it. So basically, Muruganar is saying that it's wrong to call God with form as transcendental, right?
What he's saying is that God is also in your mind. If you believe that you are an ego and you're a person, then it's quite legitimate to believe in gods that are going to help you out of this situation. But if you believe that you are the self, the unchanging reality, the one, then there is no need to invoke any external form of deity.
Exactly.
We are the self.
And then he go.
And also, what I was thinking was that this is kind of a scene-setting kind of verse. He's given us an idea that what's to follow isn't going to be about how to win God's favor or curry God's favor or any of that. So he's telling us from the start that what we are dealing with is not something external to ourselves. There's one more verse of Bhagavan here, which we could quote, which I think is a very powerful verse. And it's, I think, verse 20. To see God whilst unaware of the self that sees is merely a perception which is of the form of the mind which perceives it. Can it be said even that he who sees the self sees God, his source? When one's root, the ego, has gone, one is no longer other than God. So in this verse is, I suppose, putting us on the right track that we're going to be talking about our own self, our own being.
Right.
Not about something external to ourselves, which we need to attain, whatever.
Right. And in your notes, you kind of summarize it, that the term transcendental can strictly only be applied to the absolute, Brahman or the self in Advaita. And I believe you also mentioned
Yes,
another term in Siddhanta. So, but it can, the point is that the word transcendental can only be applied to the absolute.
yes, but we should also add to that, the absolute can't be known. This is implied. It can only be applied to the self, but we can't even describe that Brahman or that self.
Right.
We can only be it.
We can only
So
be it. Yeah.
Not trying to imply that, oh yes, transcendental only applies to Brahman, because that's just doing the same thing. It's objectivizing
Right.
the self again. But yeah, the term transcendental can only be strictly applied to our experience of the self, if you like. But
so I have a question, Robert. Why does do you think why Muruganar would have wanted to say this as his first neṟi?
well, that was the reason. I think he was just trying to set us on the right track, to get us thinking in terms of turning the attention inwards instead of outwards towards, towards other books, phenomena of the world, or anything else. So that's the only thing that I can think of it. That it's
I think
a general statement about the general subject of the neṟis that are going to follow.
Right. He wants to make sure we are all in the track of absolute non-dualism.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah. Does anyone have any questions for Robert on the first neṟi, please?
Yeah. Can I?
Yeah, please go ahead, Anand.
Yeah. To begin with, the pāyiram that he started with is, in terms of its construction, and more importantly, in its conceptual beauty, it's something that really strikes one, because generally pāyirams are written with these attributes of God, which do not bring out the implied transcendental form of nature of God himself or herself. So in Robert's pāyiram, he addresses the Lord as one with big head, Ganesha, and so that is generally a way of, this is my limited way of understanding it. All these prayers that are made in the beginning of a journey, this is a neṟi, which is a journey, right? It's a marga. Neṟi is a marga. So when you undertake a journey, you always, pray to God. That's a customary thing for a normal, spiritually minded person. So that immediately lets you surrender your ego to something which is beyond you. In the so along that same, actually one other thing is Muruganar has a preface which says that even though these truths told in this work are going to really be a very big support, very staunch support, it may not be palatable to many other, to all.
Exactly.
Right. This may not please everyone, because he says if they want to differ, let them differ, but he makes a disclaimer.
Yeah.
Yeah. So in that sense, the way to understand, I'm trying to make a compromise. When you say aprakritam, transcendental, it is in the context of formed worship, worshipping a God with form. You have to realize that that form itself is not like yours and mine. It's transcendental in the sense it has it pervades the whole universe. The form itself, like if you take any of these many standard archana sutras called Sahasranamas, 1,000 names for almost every god has a 1,000 name archana. Every one of them will have Sahasraksha Sahasrapad. You have thousands of feet and thousands of heads, meaning that the Ishvara that we worship, even though in the form of a Ganesha or a Shiva, is for that immediate purpose of relating to your ego with that. It is confined. It is in fact transcendental. Ishvara is also defined as one who is just like a jnani. He is aware of his ultimate self. He is always in his, established in his self. It's very similar to a guru coming in. Ishvaro Guru Atmeti Murti Bheda Vibhagine. Ishwaran, Guru, and yourself are real. Are all various forms. Murti Bheda actually means various forms. Differences so they are only in appearance they are different, but not in content.
So they're all one and the same.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. That was nice. So now, Ananth, please go ahead and read the second Neṟi, please. Tamil.
Yeah. Arivai arindorku abayam illai. Arivai arindorku abayam illai.
Robert, I'll let you take over.
Did we have a quote here?
Yeah. You want to read it?
Well, no, I'll come to it. It's coming up, yeah. So, what is meant by danger? This is another word which can be translated in various ways, but also has the meaning is misfortune, calamity, and in Sanskrit, destruction, death, loss, annihilation. So why is there no danger or no loss if you know the nature of consciousness? It's because we can only suffer loss if we are separate from something, if we have a second thing to lose, if there's duality. So Bhagavan explains that if we step back into the self and we just see the world as unity, we perceive it as the screen, we're in the screen, the body's in the screen, it's all in the screen, there's no duality, there's no second, there is no fear, because it's only when we identify with the body and then create name and form and create imaginary other people and things that we're in danger. And the quote that Kumar's going to show us now is from Conscious Immortality, which I will read out, which explains this point. How to get rid of fear. Well, that's the same thing, isn't it? Danger, loss, destruction. It's not destruction we're afraid of, it's fear we're afraid of in a way, isn't it? Fear is the key.
Yeah.
All fear is nothing more than thoughts. If there is only one, there cannot be a second to be afraid. If we look to ourselves, then as it is one, there is no second to be afraid of. To think that there is something outside ourselves is the cause of fear. But if firmly rooted in our own reality, then there will be no fear, no doubt, no undesirable qualities, as all the latter are centered about the ego.
Right.
So it seems to be saying here in this Neṟi that that we should, that's what we should do. That if we find our true home in the self, then there will not be any fear, because there'll only be the one, the self.
Right. Thank you, Robert. And anyone has any questions on the second neṟi to Robert? Okay. If not, we'll go ahead to the third neṟi. And Ananth, please go ahead and read the Tamil, please.
உணர்ந்தோர்க்கு உண்மை உறுதி பயக்கம். உணர்ந்தோர்க்கு உண்மை உறுதி பயக்கம்.
For those who have come to know the truth itself will foster certainty. By certainty, Robert made this comment, by certainty, Sri Muruganar means the only certainty that we can obtain is in realizing our true nature. If we accomplish this, we will have no need for any further validation. I'll let Robert explain further. Please go ahead.
Yes, well, to put this another way, we could say that the only way we can attain certainty is to discover the truth. And the only way to discover the truth is to investigate ourselves, our own being. And the only way to investigate our own being is to just be. The proof of the pudding is in the eating. We have to do it. There's no other way. And the only way we're going to get that certainty, this neṟi comes early on because it's saying, don't look outside. No one's going to help you. Well, they will help you ultimately, guide you, like the neṟis guide you, but the actual work has to be done yourself, internally. So at some point we need to abandon our rather desperate need for external validation, and we need to rely on our own insights. But by reading these kind of works, we can strengthen that conviction, and it's like a virtuous circle. The more we're convinced, the more we're certain, the more we'll be able to stay with our true self, and the more we stay with our true self, the more. So here is again, he's pointing to a kind of inner process where we can gradually build up. People say, you get enlightened in a flash or whatever, but whatever happens, what leads up to it is a very, very long process. And this certainty is the one tool that we really need. Otherwise we will give up, we won't carry on.
Thank you, Robert. Yeah, thank you, Robert. Does anyone have any questions or comments on the third neṟi that we just discussed?
I just
yes, Stephen, go ahead. Yeah.
Let me turn my camera on. Sorry, I didn't see that. In regards to this, partially into the last verse, I had some insight a while ago. The last verse was talking about fear. What is there to fear if there is no other? I'm paraphrasing, but it occurred to me a while ago that a natural morality is found through this kind of realization too, because it wouldn't occur to you to kill, cheat, steal from another if you didn't experience that. Morality naturally, or ethics, arises from this realization too. Anyway, I just add that to this discussion.
Absolutely true, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. That's all I wanted to say.
Yeah, that's good. That's a good point. Thank you. Anyone else? So, if not, we will move on to the final neṟi for today, which is the fourth neṟi. And Ananth, please.
Varattu vadam, varattu elimbu, anubhava jnanam āyiram pon. வரட்டுவாதம் வரட்டெலும்பு அனுபவ ஞானம் 1000 பொன்.
Empty disputation is like dry bones. Knowledge born of experience is worth 1,000 gold pieces. In his notes, these are the couple of salient points from Robert. 1,000 gold pieces is here employed in a figurative sense to indicate something of great worth. The phrase occurs in Proverbs, such as, living or dead, an elephant is worth 1,000 gold pieces. I think the Tamil proverb is, யானை இறந்தாலும் இருந்தாலும் 1000 பொன். Right. So I will let you take over now, Robert. Please go ahead.
So there's a fine line, isn't there, to be drawn between idle discussion and discussion that leads to something, that leads to growth or leads to further reflection, or talk that stops us talking rather than. So basically, it's a question of discrimination. We have to know when we're just talking for the sake of it, because we like the sound of our own voices and we've read a few shastras and we can quote this, that, and the other. So I think it's just a warning that to avoid unnecessary discussion, which is basically just for one's own pleasure or gratification and brings us nothing. I think that's all it's saying, but it's a very valid point.
Any discussion has to be towards that goal. Right?
Yes, well, it has to be part of a process.
Exactly.
We've talked about Tetra clearing away the undergrowth, the brush, or I'm being convinced, getting to a central truth and sticking to the quest to find it, and not being distracted in all these pathways that lead nowhere.
Right. Any other comments, Robert?
No, I don't think so for that one.
Okay. Anyone else has any questions on the fourth Neṟi?
I don't quite understand. This is kind of a trivial question, but I don't understand why an elephant would be worth 1,000 gold pieces dead.
Because of its tusks, its hide, its meat, and everything.
Oh, okay, got it. Thank you.
It's a bit of a cynical proverb. Dead or alive. You can imagine some guy saying, Tamil Nadu, 1,000 years ago, saying, look, whether it's dead or alive, it's worth 10,000 rupees to you. What do you care? You're going to get the money either way. That's the way it struck me anyway.
Yeah.
It's for the tusk, right?
Well, you've got the tusk. I don't know what the useful parts of an elephant are, but apart from giving the hide to Shiva to wear, but
the tusk is supposed to be very valuable.
Yeah. I suppose if there were very big tusks. I don't think the Indian elephant has that massive tusks anyway, does it? But presumably a dead elephant was worth a lot of money in those days, as well as a live one.
Yeah. So it's sort of the figurative sense. Muruganar is saying that, going back to the verse, knowledge born of experience is worth 1,000 gold pieces.
Well, yeah, we haven't really covered the experience part, have we? In this context, I think the experience is the experience of the practice of dwelling on the self, not because knowledge born of experience could be anything, couldn't it? I mean, if you learn how to throw a pot, you become a good potter. So knowledge born of experience, presumably he means experience of the self rather than any external experience that we might gain in the world at large, as it were.
Right.
Yeah.
The true experience, self-knowledge.
But it's true anyway on a lower level, isn't it? And somebody that studied something and knows it well is much more qualified to deal with it than someone who's just read about it. So it's true on every level. Even the, you know, if you know how to write I can't think of an example, but
I have an example.
go on.
The experience of touching a hot stove is worth 1,000 gold pieces.
That's a good one. Yes, that's a good one.
Good.
Okay.
That again, that is a metaphor for, in a way, of not dwelling in the self, because when we allow ourselves to wander off into the world, we burn ourselves on the stove of māyā, don't we? Every time we reach out and forget we're supposed to be dwelling in the self, and we get stung, burnt. So it's a warning to return.
Right.
And thank you for that, because the metaphor can be physical and the metaphor can be actually the experience of the heart.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yes, because Muruganar says quite often in his commentary, Aksharamanamalai, that the suffering that someone that's getting near to realizing himself suddenly gets caught up. The suffering is quite unbearable for some people, because they get close and they fall into the trap, and he expatiates at some length upon the suffering that those people that are getting near to their goal, when they fall, it's a great suffering, because they lose that piece of the self that they spent so much time trying to gain. So.
Right. Thank you so much. With that, we will conclude our discussion of the first four neṟis.